For thousands of years, one simple belief controlled how millions of people viewed intimacy, marriage, and the human body. And almost everything they believed was about to be challenged in ways nobody could have predicted. In less than 80 years, a nation would move from ancient temple carvings celebrating the human form, to colonial-era laws, criminalizing entire communities, to a modern digital society debating consent, identity, and freedom in ways that would have been unthinkable to their grandparents. And the biggest surprise, the one almost nobody sees coming, comes right at the very end of this video. Today, we are uncovering the hidden, layered social history of India between 1947 and 2026. Not a story about scandal, but a story about power, law, silence, and change. What happened after independence to the openness that once existed in ancient art and literature? Why did a colonial-era law stay on the books for over 150 years after the people who wrote it had gone home? Who were the ordinary, everyday people, lawyers, doctors, and dedicated researchers who quietly changed absolutely everything? What exactly was hidden from television screens, from classrooms, and from newspapers for so many long generations? And why does understanding this full story still matter for how modern India thinks about relationships, gender, and rights today? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a society moved from silence to conversation, and what still remains unresolved even now, in 2026. You will also see how a handful of court cases, spread across nearly 3 decades, ended up reshaping how an entire nation of over 1 billion people talks about identity, family, and law. Let's start at the beginning. Long before 1947, the Indian subcontinent had a complicated and often surprising relationship with openness about intimacy. Ancient temples like Khajuraho and Konark displayed carvings depicting couples in intimate poses, carved directly into the walls of sacred structures meant to be viewed by pilgrims and worshippers alike. Classical texts discussed relationships, courtship, and companionship as part of a broader philosophy of living a balanced life, alongside duty, wealth, and spiritual growth. Regional folk traditions, poetry, and court literature across many centuries described a wide range of human relationships without the shame or secrecy that would later come to define public discussion of the subject. And traveling scholars and merchants recorded similar observations in their own writings after visiting the region during earlier historical periods. This was not treated as scandalous. It was treated as one dimension of human experience worth studying and understanding, much like art, music, governance, or philosophy. But by the time India gained independence in August 1947, that older openness had already been buried under more than a century of colonial-era law and Victorian social attitudes imported from Britain. The British colonial administration had introduced strict moral codes in the 19th century, including a criminal law provision from 1861 that classified certain private relationships between consenting adults as an unnatural offense, punishable by lengthy imprisonment. This law did not originate from Indian tradition. It was modeled directly on British legal codes from the same era, codes that Britain itself would eventually abandon at home decades before India did. When India became independent, this law was inherited along with thousands of other colonial statutes, largely unexamined in the rush of nation-building, constitutional drafting, and post-partition recovery. Retention hook. But this wasn't even the strangest part of the story. The stranger part is that the newly independent government, busy drafting a constitution built on liberty, equality, and dignity, left this particular law almost completely untouched for decades. Historians who have studied the parliamentary records of the 1950s note there was little serious debate on the subject at all. It was inherited quietly, treated as settled colonial legal furniture, and largely ignored by lawmakers focused on partition recovery, economic planning, food security, and building entirely new institutions from scratch. Chapter 2 takes us into the mid-20th century, when a strange contradiction defined public life in India. On one hand, Bollywood cinema of the 1950s and 1960s used suggestive song sequences, rain-soaked dance numbers, and romantic symbolism to hint at attraction without ever showing anything explicit. Filmmakers like Guru Dutt and Raj Kapoor built entire visual languages using flowers, water, thunderstorms, and metaphor to communicate romance to audiences under strict censorship guidelines enforced by the Central Board of Film Certification, a body that reviewed every frame of every film before public release. On the other hand, real conversations about relationships, health, and consent were almost completely absent from schools, homes, and public discourse. Doctors reported that many patients could not accurately describe basic reproductive health concepts well into adulthood, because formal education simply did not cover the topic in any structured way, leaving entire generations to piece together fragments of understanding from rumor, folklore, and whispered conversation. The evidence for this gap comes from an unusual source: government-funded family planning campaigns launched in the 1950s and 1960s. Faced with a rapidly growing population and limited resources, the state invested heavily in posters, radio programs, traveling health vans, and later television advertisements to teach basic family planning concepts to a population that had almost no formal education on the subject. These campaigns are now studied by historians as the first large-scale, state-sponsored public conversations about intimacy and reproduction in independent India, decades before schools would introduce anything resembling structured health education. The timeline here is revealing. The same government that avoided legal reform on colonial-era criminal statutes stepped in aggressively and repeatedly when population growth threatened economic planning targets, showing that official silence on the subject was selective rather than absolute. Researchers who have examined government archives from this period note something else that rarely makes it into mainstream retellings. Many of these early family planning posters and radio scripts were drafted by a small handful of bureaucrats with almost no medical training, working under enormous pressure to produce results quickly. Because there was no established public vocabulary for discussing these topics in most regional languages, health campaigns often borrowed euphemisms from agriculture and gardening to describe reproduction. A linguistic workaround that historians say shaped how entire generations learned to talk, or avoid talking, about the subject in everyday conversation. This improvised vocabulary would go on to influence textbooks, newspaper articles, and even courtroom language for decades afterward. Retention, hook. Then everything changed because of one decision. Not a new law, but a lawsuit filed by a small group of determined activists. In 1994, an organization called the AIDS Bedbah Virodi Andolan filed one of the earliest legal challenges to the colonial-era law, arguing that it violated constitutional protections and actively harmed public health efforts by driving vulnerable communities away from medical care out of fear of prosecution and police harassment. This case did not succeed immediately, and it would take years before it was even properly heard. But it planted a legal seed that would take root over the following 2 decades, inspiring a new generation of lawyers and public health advocates. Chapter 3 reveals a hidden truth that surprises most viewers. The biggest myth about this entire era is that change happened suddenly in the 2010s. In reality, the groundwork was being built quietly for nearly 2 decades before that. Public health workers, lawyers, and researchers spent the 1990s and early 2000s documenting how the old law was being used not primarily to prosecute private conduct, but as a tool for police harassment, extortion, and blackmail against vulnerable communities, particularly in poor urban neighborhoods where legal representation was scarce and reporting abuse carried enormous personal risk. A landmark study conducted by health researchers in the early 2000s found that fear of the law was a major barrier preventing outreach workers from distributing health information and testing services during the growing public health crisis of the era, a finding that would later become central to legal arguments before the courts. Myth versus reality here is striking. The myth, the law was rarely enforced, so it didn't really matter to ordinary people's lives. The reality documented by legal researchers and human rights organizations, the mere existence of the law gave law enforcement officers enormous leverage to harass, threaten, and extort money from vulnerable individuals without ever needing to secure an actual conviction in court. Unexpected fact, some of the strongest legal arguments against the law came not from activist groups first, but from public health researchers and doctors who framed it as a direct obstacle to disease prevention and treatment access, a framing that proved far more persuasive to courts and to a skeptical public than moral arguments alone ever could have been. Retention. Hook. But historians found something nobody expected. The same decade that saw quiet legal organizing also saw an explosion of media visibility that nobody had planned or predicted, arriving from a completely unexpected direction. Chapter 4 shows the conflict growing sharper as more of society became aware of the debate. Religious organizations across multiple faiths in India entered the discussion as legal challenges gained momentum in the mid-2000s, arguing that changing the law would undermine traditional family structures and long-held cultural values. Political parties largely avoided taking a firm public stance on the issue, wary of alienating conservative voting blocs ahead of elections, which meant that for years the loudest voices on both sides came from courts, medical researchers, and civil society organizations, rather than from elected politicians themselves. Meanwhile, cultural shifts were happening in parallel and largely outside the control of any single institution. Satellite television arrived in Indian homes in the 1990s, bringing international news, entertainment, and different social norms into living rooms for the first time in the nation's history. Cable news channels began covering court proceedings related to the law by the mid-2000s, introducing the topic to a mainstream household audience that had previously only encountered it through whispered rumor, coded film references, or academic journals inaccessible to most citizens. This period also saw a significant cultural shift driven by the economic liberalization that began in 1991. As India's economy opened up to global markets, Urban youth gained access to more education, more exposure to international media, and more financial independence from their families than any previous generation had experienced. Sociologists studying this period note a measurable shift in survey responses about relationship attitudes among urban educated respondents between the early 1990s and the mid-2000s, even as rural attitudes changed far more slowly and unevenly, creating a widening cultural gap between city and countryside that persists in some recognizable form even today, decades later. Retention hook. And this is where history took a completely different turn, because in 2009, something happened that nobody, not even the lawyers who had spent years building the case, fully expected to see in their lifetime. Chapter 5 delivers the first big reveal of this story. On July 2nd, 2009, the Delhi High Court issued a landmark ruling declaring that the colonial-era law, as it applied to consenting adults acting in private, violated fundamental constitutional rights to equality, dignity, and privacy guaranteed under India's own constitution. The ruling was celebrated as a historic moment, covered extensively by national and international media outlets, and treated by many commentators as the final resolution of a century-and-a-half-old legal question that had outlived the empire that created it. Viewers watching news coverage from that week would have had every reason to believe the matter was permanently settled, that the strange colonial relic had finally been removed from Indian law for good. I never knew, and most people watching at the time never knew, that this moment would turn out to be only the halfway point of the story, not the ending. Retention hook. The next discovery completely changes everything, because 4 years later, the story reversed itself in a way almost nobody anticipated, sending shockwaves through the very communities who had just begun to celebrate. Chapter 6 moves into deeper explanation, using legal records and constitutional analysis gathered from court archives. In December 2013, the Supreme Court of India overturned the Delhi High Court's ruling, reinstating the colonial-era provision in full and stating that any change to the law was a matter for Parliament to decide through legislation, not something the judiciary should determine through interpretation. This reversal stunned civil society organizations that had spent nearly 2 decades building momentum toward what they believed was permanent legal change, and it was described by many legal commentators at the time as one of the most significant judicial reversals in the country's post-independence history. Archaeological and historical scholarship on ancient Indian art and literature was cited repeatedly during this period by advocates trying to demonstrate that criminalization was a colonial import rather than an indigenous cultural value, pointing again to temple carvings, classical texts, and regional folk traditions that had documented diverse relationship patterns for centuries before colonial law ever arrived on the subcontinent. Legal scholars specializing in constitutional history noted that the 2013 reversal relied heavily on the argument that only a small percentage of the population was directly affected by the provision, a statistical framing that itself became a subject of fierce academic and legal debate in the years that followed, with critics arguing that constitutional rights should never depend on the size of the affected population. Retention hook. But there's one fact almost nobody talks about. The 2013 reversal actually accelerated organizing rather than shutting it down, because it forced a broader coalition of lawyers, doctors, parents, business leaders, and public figures to engage with the issue publicly for the very first time, many of them for the first time in their lives. Chapter 7 brings an unexpected twist that contradicts what most people assume about this history. Between 2014 and 2018, an unusual coalition formed that surprised even longtime observers of the movement. It included not just longtime activists and lawyers, but also prominent business leaders, mental health professionals, doctors, and even members of extended royal and aristocratic families who had personal connections to the cause, giving the movement a level of media visibility and mainstream respectability it had never had before in its history. Curative petitions were filed at the Supreme Court, and this time the legal arguments leaned heavily on evolving international legal precedent, expanded scientific understanding of human diversity published in medical journals throughout the 2000s and 2010s, and emotional testimony from families describing the psychological toll of decades of silence, secrecy, and fear. New evidence presented to the court included research from major psychological and psychiatric associations that had, by this period, formally stated that variation in human attraction was a natural part of human diversity, rather than a disorder or illness, directly contradicting the assumptions that had shaped the original colonial-era law more than a century and a half earlier. Journalists covering the run-up to the final hearings noted a striking change in tone compared to coverage from just 5 years earlier. Newspapers that had once buried related stories in back sections began running front-page features, opinion columns from retired judges, and interviews with parents describing their own personal journeys toward understanding and acceptance. Television anchors who had avoided the topic entirely during the 2013 reversal now hosted primetime panel debates featuring lawyers, doctors, and religious leaders side by side, a level of open mainstream discussion that would have been almost unimaginable just 1 decade earlier. Legal analysts tracking the case noted that the bench specifically requested additional scientific literature during the hearings, a signal that the court intended to ground its eventual decision in evidence rather than tradition or sentiment alone. Retention hook. The final piece of the puzzle is even more unbelievable than anything that came before it, because on September 6, 2018, a 5-judge constitutional bench delivered a unanimous verdict that would finally permanently settle the question that had divided the nation for generations. Chapter 8 delivers the payoff, answering every question this video introduced at the very start. The Supreme Court ruled that the colonial-era criminalization of private, consensual relationships between adults was unconstitutional, restoring dignity and legal protection nationwide in a single sweeping judgment. Chief Justice Deepak Misra wrote in the judgment that history owed an apology to affected communities and their families for the delay in providing justice. One of the most widely quoted lines in modern Indian legal history, and one that appeared on the front page of nearly every major newspaper the following morning. This was the biggest reveal of the entire story. A law imported from a foreign colonial power in 1861, defended for over a century and a half as though it reflected authentic indigenous tradition, was finally recognized by India's own highest court as fundamentally incompatible with the constitutional values the country had written for itself back in 1950. The most surprising fact for many viewers is this. The ancient openness depicted in temple art and classical texts was not simply an isolated historical curiosity. It was evidence used directly in 21st century courtrooms to argue that criminalization had never been an authentic part of long-term Indian tradition at all, but rather a temporary colonial imposition eventually rejected by the very legal system that had once enforced it without question for generations. The modern connection reaches directly into today. Since 2018, India has seen visible cultural shifts across many sectors of public life. Mainstream television dramas and streaming platforms have introduced storylines exploring relationships and identity that would have been unthinkable on national television just 15 years earlier. Corporate workplaces began adopting formal inclusion policies and support networks through the early 2020s, often citing the 2018 verdict directly in internal training materials. Educational institutions slowly began introducing more comprehensive health curricula, though implementation remains uneven across different states and remains a subject of ongoing political and cultural debate even now in 2026, nearly a decade after the landmark ruling. Legal recognition of relationship rights beyond the 2018 ruling, including questions of marriage equality and adoption rights, remains an active and unresolved legal question still being argued in Indian courts as this video is being made, showing that this story, despite its dramatic milestones and hard-won victories, has not actually reached its final chapter. Public opinion surveys conducted across major Indian cities between 2018 and 2025 show a measurable generational divide. Younger, urban respondents report significantly more openness and attitudes than older generations, while rural and smaller town attitudes continue to shift more gradually and unevenly, echoing the same urban-rural divide that sociologists first documented back in the 1990s and 2000s. Meanwhile, digital platforms and dating applications, which barely existed in India before the mid-2010s, have transformed how young adults form relationships entirely, creating both new freedoms and entirely new anxieties around privacy, safety, and consent that lawmakers, technology companies, and families are all still working to address heading into 2026 and beyond. Researchers studying this most recent period point to another quiet but significant shift. Workplaces, universities, and even some family courts have started referencing the 2018 judgment as a foundation for broader policy decisions that extend well beyond its original scope, from workplace harassment guidelines to hospital visitation rules to inheritance disputes. None of this existed in any formal policy document before 2018, meaning that a single constitutional ruling has quietly reshaped dozens of unrelated areas of Indian law and administration over less than a decade, a ripple effect that few observers predicted at the time the verdict was first announced. So let's recap what actually happened across nearly 8 decades of Indian history. India entered independence in 1947, carrying colonial-era laws that criminalized private adult relationships, laws that directly contradicted a much older tradition of openness found in ancient art, temple architecture, and classical literature. For decades, the topic remained almost entirely absent from formal education, filtered instead through coded cinema, whispered rumor, and state-run family planning campaigns designed for entirely different economic purposes. A quiet legal movement built strength through the 1990s and 2000s, driven as much by public health researchers and doctors as by dedicated activists and lawyers. A landmark 2009 court ruling brought hope to millions. A stunning 2013 reversal brought heartbreak and renewed determination. And a historic 2018 Supreme Court verdict finally delivered lasting constitutional change after nearly a century and a half of struggle. And today, in 2026, the conversation continues to evolve through courts, classrooms, workplaces, and technology in ways that are still actively being written. History doesn't just tell us what people did, it explains why societies became what they are today, revealing how laws written by strangers in a completely different century, under a completely different set of values, can outlive their original purpose for generations before anyone finally questions them and demands change. It also reminds us that ancient openness, colonial silence, and modern debate are not three separate stories, but three chapters of the very same one, still being written by ordinary people today. If this changed the way you think about history, there's much more hidden beneath the surface.